Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where we explore, discover, and share insights, tools, and strategies for a life well lived into elderhood. I'm your host, Donna Kim Brand, author, speaker, legacy strategy coach, and creator of the concept Living Legacy, where you choose to live life on your own terms while contributing to people, places, and projects along your life journey. I believe that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Now, the guests I bring to each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This helps you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcases some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen up your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Now, we have today lucked out with a perennial favorite, and that's Mr. Douglas Brand. Those of you familiar with him know that he spent a number of decades as a career British police officer, of which over 20 years were spent serving in the Metropolitan Police in London. His Met career peaked with him leading the Force's Public Order Training Center, and was followed by then a post as Deputy Assistant Chief Constable of South Yorkshire Police before he moved on to become the British representative of the police in the European Union. And we'll talk about that a little bit, what his major contribution was there today. Now, in October of 2003, Douglas was one of two British police officers sent to Iraq in order to build up and advise the newly formed Iraqi police in the aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the coalition troops. He was made the chief police advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Interior, and was effective enough that apparently the Iraqi president of the time, Saddam Hussein, put a price on his head. It was a bounty. Douglas was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, by the Queen in 2004 for those services in Iraq. Now, since then, he's been involved in consulting on post-conflict stabilization, leadership development, and cross-sector partnerships around the world. Currently, Douglas is working on his doctorate through the University of Oxford. So welcome, Douglas Brand.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Well, thank you. Good. Well, we were going to chat today looking at how conflict escalates and whether or not you can intervene to actually prevent a crisis. You know, in your long and storied career as an officer, you have a lot of stories to tell about that very situation. You've been in many conflicts in your role as a serving an operational police officer. So could you give us a sense of some of the variety of situations you found yourself in with escalating conflict?
Yeah, well, I think, well, first of all, just to correct you on the dates, I was in June 2003, going in just after the war had been apparently declared won by the then president. Of course, that was when it just really started out for real. But one of the issues in relation to the conflict in Iraq was a failure on the part of the coalition forces to recognize all of the historical and cultural background to what the conflict was about, and why some people revered Saddam Hussein and others hated him. And I think that the work that I'd done prior to that at least gave me the opportunity to at least start to explore where things were, because one of the things I'd done post the strikes in the United Kingdom during 1984-85, the miners' strike particularly, I was trying to find what's the origins, where does this come from? Because it doesn't just suddenly pop up and people don't start suddenly rioting on the streets. And so what I was seeking to do is to try and find the origins of how conflict starts out and then how it escalates, and then how often we fail to intervene appropriately, and consequently the conflict gets exacerbated and often gets worse rather than better.
For sure. Now, as commandant of the Public Order Training Center, you also must have had a lot of experience in riots, which is what you train people to handle, and also during the time of the Irish bombings, right?
Yeah, I think the two things are quite separate, but they do have sort of origins that are similar. What we were trying to do with at the Public Order Training Center was to say, let's not just react tactically to the manifestations of violence on the streets. Certainly in training senior police officers, let's try and get behind what are the issues? Where have we come from to get to this point where suddenly people are assembling in the streets, aggressive, wanting to take out their sort of anger on, in most cases, the police, because they represent, this sort of visible face of authority, and try and sort of work out where does that come from, and train senior police officers to sort of work through the various stages of a conflict escalation path, working from the principle of at one end of a continuum it's normal and at the other end it's abnormal. What happens in between? What changes of behavior can we observe that will allow us to intervene more effectively than just waiting for things to, collapse around our ears before we then tactically throw in loads of police officers with shields and batons and that sort of thing and try and resolve an issue. But as far as the Irish side of things are concerned, again, the origins, looking for where does this come from? Where does the belief of the IRA and other sectarian groups, where does that come from, and how can we, as a police service, and of course we're not the only agency, but as a police service, how can we address that and try and minimize the potential for either bombings or attacks of some sort or other?
So it seems then that it was actually your on-the-ground experiences and the questions you were asking yourselves, perhaps even in the midst of dealing with these conflicts, led you then to do more research and exploration about what you said, the scale moving from what most people would consider normal to abnormal in an escalation path. So how did you get introduced to the conflict escalation model that you prefer? And
well, I've done quite a lot of research, as you indicated. Various authors, various people who had written about conflict escalation, how things manifest themselves. And what we also have to recognize is at the time, the police as an organization really wasn't interested in the origins. They were basically, their view was, if there's a manifestation of disorder or riot on the street, then we go and deal with it. So it was a bit of a lone journey, but I eventually came across some work by an Austrian gentleman called Friedrich Glasel, who mapped out a sort of conflict escalation path and pointed out that at various stages along this conflict escalation path, there were different types of human behaviors going on. And that if we could understand that, then the likelihood was that we could probably intervene more effectively if we understood what was the driving forces behind this conflict. And his background was as one of the sort of the mediators, the go-betweeners during the Reagan and Gorbachev meetings over, the sort of the dismantling over time of the so-called Iron Curtain. And he found through practical work of shuttling between the two leaders and their various teams, the sorts of issues that had to be addressed before one could move on to finding solutions. And what my early discovery was that too often, certainly from a policing point of view, we tended to go in with a solution first without really actually understanding what the issues were.
Well, that's fascinating. So during your stint when you were in the British police as a serving officer and at the same time representing the British police in the European Union, you drafted with your team if I get the title right, the Conflict Management Handbook for all of the EU police services. Is that right?
Yes, it was. We went through the European Union has gone through a number of critical conventions, and this was following one of those major conventions in which there were proposals that there should be cooperation between national police forces in Europe. At that time, I think we were 23, and now it's 27, 28. The idea of being able, one police force in one country to be able to issue a warrant for the arrest of somebody in another country, and for that other country to be obliged to cooperate. And so what we did when the UK had the presidency of the European Union was to develop what I termed a conflict management manual, handbook, which was to try and describe to all the different police forces that existed in Europe common features to how conflicts occur and common ways within their own international and sovereign methods and jurisdictions, how they could actually use this handbook to manage conflict so that they could all basically sign up to the same set of rules effectively from a policing point of view.
So then it sounds like you were able to translate what Friedrich Lausel was doing on a political level to policing level. So what adaptations did you have to make, and what did that look like?
Well, Friedrich's model was an escalation model from normality to abnormality, as I explained. He broke it down into sort of three lots of three behaviors. The first behavior was what he called perceptions, which is where, you know, people have an opinion, they read something in the newspaper, or they have some sort of aggravation with somebody, and they have a perception about how things are. And perceptions are quite sort of they're quite amorphous. They can be changed if you provide the right sort of information. Then you know, you can change people's perceptions. That's the first sort of three areas. The second areas, the second three were what he called sort of fixations, which is where you started to get a little bit hardened to the other people's points of view, and you create images and coalitions to protect your position. And the original issue relating to the conflict often gets lost because now you're protecting yourself from a loss of face, and it gets to the point of where you get into sort of strategies of threat. And then finally, the final three are where you actually start taking action, destructive blows, fragmentation of what might be determined as the enemy. And then finally, the worst case scenario is where you basically adopt an approach which is effectively, I don't care how much damage we get as long as we inflict more damage than the other people on the other people. That's a very crude way of describing it. And so what I sought to do, that was Friedrich's model. And what I sought to try and do was to overlay onto that policing interventions that could be taught, so that, for instance, under the perception side of things, we introduced something called peace building, which was effectively engaging with people, providing good quality information, providing truth, answering questions, making sure that any sort of wild claims about, and you know, I'm thinking obviously of the American situation at the moment, you know, claims to an election being stolen, to provide people with facts which are verifiable, which are coming from a sound basis to influence those perceptions. That's peace building. The second one to deal with fixations is peacekeeping, where you try and stop things from getting any worse. And sometimes you actually have to intervene with a sort of a policing capability, but at the same time, you're continuing the conversation, you're continuing the dialogue. And then the final part, the